Nobody expected that priceless paintings and archives would lie hidden beneath layers of salt and silence. No one could believe this was the unspoken tone of the era if it could be captured in a single phrase. The historical narrative seemed familiar. Continental Europe lay in ruins, the Pacific Islands were scarred by storms and artillery, humanitarian teams distributed bandages and sulfa powder, engineers built makeshift piers, and medics marked coordinates of those who needed aid in blood and pencil. Yet among the reports of field dressings and evacuations, another current ran quietly beneath the surface, a methodical, almost industrial process of relocating cultural heritage. Within that shadow lay the salt, and within the salt, a vault. The documentary record fixes the details. In Europe, trains moved at night, wooden cars, camouflage covers, route sheets stripped of unnecessary markings. Inside were crates bound with steel straps, padded with straw and cloth. In the Pacific, during those same months, other cargoes were registered serums, plasma, dehydrated rations, stretchers of canvas. Field medicine followed protocol: stop the bleeding, immobilize, disinfect, evacuate to rear positions. Reports from the International Committee of the Red Cross contained measured phrases about equal access to basic aid for prisoners of war, including captured enemy combatants from amphibious operations on atolls and volcanic islands. These lines mattered. They showed that even as machines and explosives roared louder, the framework of humanity remained written and inspected. In Europe, a parallel mechanism moved forward. Warehouses and museums were sealed, doors removed from hinges, paintings packed into cases, statues wrapped in felt in tow. Transport schedules scattered across departments, yet they all shared one factor: geology. Salt mountains and mine shafts offered stable humidity, constant temperature, absence of daylight. Mold could not form there. Artillery could not reach there, and ash from burned depots did not drift so far. Heavy wooden gates were reinforced with metal braces, ventilation shafts fitted with filters, guard posts camouflaged in the forest. The material evidence of this infrastructure survived in bureaucratic ledgers, budgets for bolts and braces, exhaustive lists of tools from jacks to talc for cables. Meanwhile, on the Pacific Islands, another kind of inventory unfolded. Medical teams logged how many dressings were distributed per unit, how many tourniquets replaced, how many rolls of tape remained. Reports recorded that captured enemy soldiers, brought in after clashes near reefs and airstrips, received identical treatment. Wounds cleansed with solution, bandages applied, pain relief administered as prescribed, and, when possible, blood transfusions conducted upon compatibility. Medics followed standards, and these records sat beside tide charts and temperature tables. The chronology revealed a strange synchrony. While some carried the wounded on stretchers, others carried crates of art on slings. In Europe, method became ritual underground. The entrances to the mines looked like torn wounds in the skin of the hills. The air smelled of dust, wet limestone, and something else, a faint bitterness of salt. The storage chambers formed a geometry of corridors, each distance measured in chalk. Duty shifts logged the temperature, 8 degrees constant, humidity within range. Crates were stacked in rows and numbered. Maps were marked with rectangles and arrows, collection names written without detail. Nearby, wooden trays held restorers' tools, thin spatulas, brushes, cotton swabs, glass bottles of varnish. It was the paradox of silence. Art created for light, breathed in darkness to outlast the storm. In the Pacific, another paradox emerged. Humanitarian duty unfolded under the noise of generators and rain. Captured enemies, exhausted, stunned, often still in wet uniforms, received the same care without ceremony. The medic checked the pulse. The orderly filled a card. The doctor noted the need for antibiotics if condition allowed. No speeches, only procedure. On the yard were bandages dried on ropes, The wind's noise drowned all voices. A documentarian, had he stood there, would have heard the click of buckles, the rustle of wrappings, the tread on metal gangways. These sounds became the background that historians would later call discipline. In Europe, discipline took an engineering form. The salt strata provided protection but demanded calculation where collapse might occur, where water might drip, where timber supports were required. Engineering diagrams overlaid with lists of artworks charted routes for carrying heavy frames and fragile manuscripts. The winches groaned evenly. The workers kept their pace. On the surface, the forest murmured in tune with stone silence, but underground, one could hear only the ticking of a watch on a belt and pencil marks in a field notebook. In these minutes, an idea took shape later called salvation through concealment. The synchrony of two geographies created a single narrative. On the islands, people learned not to divide the wounded into friend or foe. In the salt lands, art learned to survive without witnesses. The realism of these processes was measured by quantifiable values: temperature and humidity, dosages and dressings, the number of trips into tunnels, the number of evacuation voyages by hospital ships. The drama ran beneath it all like a subterranean hum felt through the skin but invisible to instruments. It existed in the fact that both human life and cultural memory depended on precision, on the steadiness of a hand, the accuracy of a signature, the strength of a knot. When overlapping data began to surface: cargo manifests, inventory lists of collections, engineering blueprints of mines, it became evident that Europe's underground chambers had sheltered more than equipment and provisions. There, with military precision, lay what was meant for museums, not mines. And so the phrase, "nobody expected that," stopped being an exaggeration. It became a statement of fact, a slice of reality that required verification, routes, teams, flashlights, and cold numbers. Thus began the story where salt became a guardian of preservation, and the protocol for rendering first aid became a symbol of universal humanity uniting continents and destinies. The revelation began not with a confession but with a calculation. Months after the European front had fractured and the occupation zones were mapped in lines of ink and authority, a team of engineers and archivists stumbled upon a system of sealed tunnels beneath a small town surrounded by forested hills. The entrances were bricked up and camouflaged with debris. Air vents, once connected to ventilation machinery, were blocked by stones and moss. The site had been considered abandoned, a remnant of early mining operations used sporadically for storage. When the first reconnaissance unit entered, guided by local maps and fragments of intelligence reports, the initial impression was one of neglect-rusted rails, overturned carts, and white salt dust thick as frost on every surface. But as the light from their lamps reached deeper, the geometry of order began to appear. Rows of identical wooden crates filled the gallery like a subterranean library. Each bore stenciled markings in faded ink numbers, abbreviations, and sometimes nothing at all. The air was dry, cool, and utterly still. The men recorded humidity and temperature in the margins of their notebooks, standard procedure for a possible recovery site. One of them brushed the salt from a lid and saw, through the thin film of dust, a faint symbol of an eagle, barely visible. It was a clue to the origin, but not the purpose. The discovery was logged and photographed. Within days, the news reached administrative headquarters and a formal inventory operation was organized. The subsequent weeks unfolded in disciplined rhythm. Crate by crate, the contents were cataloged. The first contained canvases rolled in protective tubes, their pigments dulled but intact. The second revealed marble fragments wrapped in cloth. Others held books bound in leather, scrolls of parchment, even scientific instruments. The astonishment among the examiners remained unspoken, replaced by the language of documentation measurements, accession numbers, estimated weights, and condition reports. Each object was photographed under artificial light, its existence verified against partial museum records retrieved from burned archives. What emerged was an index of survival artworks, manuscripts, and cultural relics thought to have vanished in the chaos of war. The salt had preserved everything. Unlike damp earth or open vaults, the crystalline air absorbed moisture and prevented decay. Organic materials, canvas, paper, and wood remained stable. Even the metallic pigments showed minimal oxidation. Engineers realized that the geological formation itself had served as a natural climate regulator. The irony was mathematical. The same mineral once mined for human consumption had become a vault for civilization's memory. The operation now had dual significance: recovery of stolen art and assessment of preservation conditions for future transport. Parallel to this European discovery, the Pacific Command Centers continued to compile reports of humanitarian conduct. Medical personnel on small islands documented instances of aid extended to captured adversaries, treatment of fractures, surgical debridement, and post-operative care under tent roofs lit by kerosene lamps. Field hospitals reported mortality rates, transfusion statistics, and supply shortages. These records, though far removed in geography, reflected the same impulse toward method and preservation. The care of the injured mirrored the care of the artifacts, each act guided by procedure, each action measured and recorded. The two narratives, though never connected in real time, shared an underlying logic of restraint and continuity amidst destruction. In Europe, the mine's exploration expanded into a full-scale recovery effort. Specialist teams arrived: conservators, photographers, art historians, and soldiers trained in logistics. Wooden walkways were built to prevent footprints from disturbing the packed salt floor. Electric cables were laid temporarily to provide light. Each crate was opened under controlled conditions, and its contents logged onto standardized forms. Paintings by masters long presumed destroyed were identified by their composition and catalog numbers. Religious icons, tapestries, and entire archives of correspondence appeared one after another, forming a silent testimony to the deliberate and organized concealment of beauty during an age of devastation. The visual impact of the scene was stark. In the half-light, portraits stared from their frames at men in military uniforms holding clipboards. The reflection of lanterns danced across varnished surfaces. There was no applause. No exclamation, only the echo of boots and the sound of pages turning. The salt walls absorbed the noise and returned nothing. The photographs taken there would later become evidence, not art. The story of theft was now documented as thoroughly as the story of preservation. This duality defined the period. Even in secrecy, bureaucracy left its trace. Outside, trucks lined the access road, engines idling. The recovered works were packed anew in shock-absorbent casings, loaded with care, and driven toward secure depots for inspection and redistribution. Each shipment accompanied by manifests, each manifest bearing signatures and seals. The process extended over months, under the supervision of both military and civilian authorities. The salt mine gradually emptied, revealing its full-scale kilometers of galleries, some still uncharted, others collapsed. Geologists examined the structure, confirming that the mine could remain stable for decades if left untouched. Yet the decision was made to seal it once more, not for concealment, but for preservation of its condition as evidence. Meanwhile, on distant Pacific shores, the discipline of medical care persisted. Rescue teams rotated between islands, following outbreaks of disease and post-combat injuries. Prisoners and soldiers alike were recorded as patients, their charts written in the same clinical language. Syringes were sterilized in boiling water. Scalpels were cleaned in alcohol. Plasma bags were rationed equally. The neutrality of medicine became a quiet defiance of chaos, much like the neutrality of the salt that preserved the paintings. In both domains, structure resisted entropy. By the time investigators compiled the first comprehensive report, the data covered thousands of objects and detailed testimonies from witnesses. The conclusion was unambiguous. The mine had been one of several secret repositories established to safeguard or appropriate art during the final years of occupation. Its discovery provided not only a catalog of losses reversed, but also a portrait of systematic planning. The language of the report was dry, devoid of sentiment. Yet between its lines existed an unspoken narrative of endurance. Artworks had survived not through miracles, but through geology, engineering, and the improbable persistence of order amidst ruin. As winter set across Europe, the mine was closed and guarded. The final photograph taken showed the entrance sealed by timber beams, the ground white with frost, the forest silent. Inside, residual salt dust clung to the air, glowing faintly in flashlight beams before settling once more. What remained above ground was a network of papers, lists, and coded memories, a testament to the human compulsion to protect meaning, even when meaning itself seemed at risk of extinction. When the doors of the salt mine were finally sealed, the silence above them carried the weight of two histories, one buried beneath Europe, another scattered across the Pacific. The mine's existence was no longer rumor, it had become a verified entry in the record of war. As investigators compiled their conclusions and museums identified recovered works, another kind of reconstruction unfolded far from the continent. Across the ocean, medical and relief units were still documenting lives saved and lost. Both efforts, the cataloging of art and the cataloging of wounds, belonged to a single continuum: the restoration of order after the most systematic disorder known to modern history. In the months after the discovery, European cities turned into archives. Warehouses became restoration centers. Conservators checked for mold and damage under patched roofs. Photographs revealed paintings once thought destroyed in Vienna, Paris, and Florence. Each unpacked work was logged, cleaned, and stored in temporary depositories until ownership could be verified. Restitution was defined officially as recovery of property, but morally, it was restoration of memory. The salt mine had preserved objects. Humanity had to restore meaning. A similar principle guided the Pacific field hospitals, the difference between saving a body and saving a person. Their reports echoed the same precision: recovery rates, infection control, training of local orderlies, and strict neutrality. Aid was given without judgment, as procedure demanded. Both enterprises depended on neutrality and discipline. In ruined capitals, it meant returning art without vengeance. On remote islands, it meant treating the wounded without bias. Reports from both hemispheres shared the same tone: measured, factual, restrained. Beneath that restraint lay an understanding that precision itself was a form of compassion. To restore a painting or a patient required devotion to process, a refusal to let chaos dictate the outcome. The salt mine, once emptied, became a monument to that principle. Its tunnels were mapped, sealed, and left intact as a geological archive of contradiction. Scholars who visited years later described the sensation of entering a space preserved from decay, not sacred, but exact. The outlines of crates still marked the walls, the impressions of pallets remained on the floor. Time had stabilized the mine just as salt had stabilized its contents. The tools of concealment had become tools of endurance. In the Pacific, endurance took simpler form: prefabricated clinics, water units, mobile aid stations. Supplies were scarce, yet documentation remained precise. Lists of morphine ampules, gauze rolls, and plasma units mirrored the art inventories in layout and tone. Even when storms destroyed facilities, new records began immediately. Documentation itself became a ritual of recovery. As Europe rebuilt its cultural order, the islands rebuilt the idea of humanitarian order, a structure of care beyond allegiance. The convergence of these two strands defined the post-war recovery. The mine's discovery proved that civilization had tried to preserve its reflection even in darkness. The humanitarian missions proved that compassion could exist without sentimentality, as a matter of discipline. Together they formed a principle historians would later call procedural morality, the belief that order and neutrality could preserve ethics when emotion could not. By the decade's end, most artworks had returned to their origins. Some hung again in museums, others remained in storage. In the Pacific, medical missions evolved into public health programs. The same handwriting that once listed the contents of a crate now recorded vaccination statistics. The same care once used to lift a painting now guided a patient's arm. In that continuity lay proof that structure had survived chaos. Years later, when archives from both hemispheres were compared, the symmetry became clear. The preservation of beauty in salt and the preservation of life amid ruin. Both depended on the same human trait, the will to act methodically in destruction's shadow. Nobody expected that endurance would be found in ledgers and salt, in protocols and patience. Yet it was documented, verified, quietly monumental. The final report, written in plain bureaucratic prose, offered no grand conclusion. It simply stated that all materials were secured, all humanitarian operations completed, and monitoring would continue as resources allowed. Behind that restraint lay the invisible thread connecting both worlds, a thread woven of order, care, and endurance. The war had ended, the salt had settled, and the records remained, silent witnesses to a civilization that had preserved the means to rebuild itself.